Okay, so now we discuss module number 4 for our intro to sociology class. This will be a very long video because as you have seen in the previous lectures that I have prescribed to you from the crash course playlist on sociology, there are a lot of concepts that were discussed. So brace yourselves again. So let's first talk about socialization, and I won't go into detail about how Nicole was able to explain it in the previous videos. Again, the goal for this specific video is to contextualize it using examples from the Philippine context. So, here are some of the concepts that were discussed under socialization lecture, and then we discussed about primary socialization. Basically, this is the type of socialization that we get from our family members or from where we're born. And in the Philippines, this is very important because the family is still a very strong institution in the Philippines, unlike other developed countries. Most Asian countries and Southeast Asian countries have a very family cohesive and tight-knit families pa rin. So, primary socialization is still with the family in the Philippines. And then, of course, they were able to also explain about secondary socialization. This is the type of socialization from the voluntary organizations and institutions that we basically get into as we go on with our lives and go out of our families, which include our peers, our school, etc., etc. And in the Philippines, in our families, where we have our primary socialization, we have specific categories of socialization, which we have gender, race, and class socialization. So gender socialization is still very, very strong within the family. And of course, within the family, we are taught about gender norms like what color and what type of toys and what type of clothes should a girl and a boy wear. And then we also see our parents as our more role model for what it is being a boy or a girl or a man or a woman in society. Of course, fathers are expected to become role models of what it is to be male and masculine in the country and in society. And the same thing with the females or the mothers who are supposed to be the role models of being females in society. And it is also within the family where we are sanctioned if we go against what the normal gender roles are. No? Especially if you live in a very traditional neighborhood, in a very traditional family. Now, for example, if you are a boy and you start, desiring for dolls or Barbies, and you desire to wear anything pink, or if you start acting feminine, then you get sanctioned. Your behaviors will be policed by your family. They will show disdain against the behaviors that you're showing, and you also get to learn that, okay, this is not supposedly the way a man should act in society, which again, of course, that's very traditional. In a progressive world, it should not be like that anymore. But that is the way the family tries to tell you that this should be the gender norm. If you want to survive in this society, you should follow this gender norm. The same thing also for females when they start, getting more friends that are males, getting into rowdy combat sports. They are also being reprimanded or sanctioned by their parents and other relatives and their neighbors, saying na these aren't acceptable behaviors. And through this sanctioning by our family, we get to be primarily socialized of what it means to be man or woman in a certain society. And of course, elsewhere, in other countries where race is a very important component that basically constrains or facilitates the way your life outcomes would be, within your family, you are also socialized based on how your race or ethnicity or nationality should be acting in a given society in order to maintain your presence and existence and being safe. Like for example, there are many Filipino Americans in the United States, doon na sila nanganak, they were able to build their families there, but still the parents who are migrants from the Philippines, they would still want their Phil-Am children to be able to inculcate Filipino culture through values, through language, and through food, and through different traditions by still integrating them within Filipino cultures found in America or in other countries wherein there are also Filipino communities. So, race socialization, telling you how you should act, you should behave as a member of a certain race or ethnicity. Also, in the family, we also get to learn about how we should behave, how we should act, and how we should feel as a member of a certain social class. Now, for example, I was born from a poor family, and I was socialized that I shouldn't desire for very expensive things, very expensive toys. I should budget my money. I should save as much as I could so that I have something for the rainy days. I should not buy expensive food from the canteen because we didn't have that much money. So that's example of how I was socialized as a person coming from a poor family. And even if we had some sort of upward social mobility as a family, some of the traits and behaviors that I got socialized in coming from a poor family, I still bring it. Like, for example, I'm still very frugal because my mother is Pangasinense, and frugality is something, it's a trait that she, directly passed on to me and my brother. So I still practice that. I still act as if I'm not a middle class citizen because I was generally raised as a boy from a poor family, and still take on those roles and behaviors. And then we also have anticipatory socialization, wherein we are being socialized to take on behaviors and norms of groups that we are still about to get into. Like, for example, prior to going to school, our parents would tell us, oh, you always have to behave, you always have to listen to elders, you have to play and not tease your classmates and your friends, no? But your family is teaching you about school norms and school policies even before you go into school, so that they kind of anticipate already the behaviors that you should be taking prior to getting into school. So that's anticipatory socialization. Another would be, for instance, in college, you are already socialized to, pass your assignments using during the correct deadline. You are already being trained to do hard work. You're already trained to do a lot of life and career skills. You're already being taught about public speaking. It's because you are being socialized so that you'll be able to behave well and survive well in the work life that we are still going to get into after graduation. But before graduation, in your college, you're already socializing you to become an ideal worker, an ideal employee, or an ideal businessman. And then, here we have the list of the different social institutions that influence us and socializes us and tells us how to be a good member of society, to become a good citizen of the country that we are in. And of course, like we said, during primary socialization, the number one social agent that we have for socialization is family. Basically tells us how to be a person in a community, a person in the society, and gives us what Bourdieu describes as a cultural capital. The cultural norms, beliefs, and behaviors that will be able to help us in surviving a society. Imagine if your family didn't teach you that, you should speak with using po and opo when you're speaking to elders. Imagine how awkward it would be when you go to school and your teacher tells you, why don't you know how to use po and opo? Weren't you taught at home? And because the behavior of doing po and opo is a cultural capital that makes you succeed in school life, at least, no? A very minute component of, being able to traverse school life. And it's not just po and opo, but other norms that make you an acceptable citizen in society. Those are the things that are considered cultural capital that the family should have taught you. Next one, we have education. And for those who went through formal education, we know that this is a very important agent that basically socialized you into a better person in society, not just because of the norms and the beliefs and the behaviors and the symbols that makes you a good Filipino in this Philippine society, but also about the knowledge that you need to know in order to become a useful and productive citizen in society because of formal education. But aside from that, education also was what we call a hidden curriculum. It's latent function. It's not an intended purpose of the school to teach you these things because it's not part of the syllabus, but you get to learn it anyway in the school and makes you an acceptable member of society. So we've discussed this before, what is being taught to us by the school that is not part of the written curriculum. Being on time. We also learn about respecting elders. We also learn about, grouping with the people that have the same interests with us, building friendships. These are not part of the syllabus that you're taught of since you were kinder. But these are the things that you eventually learn because you are placed in schools, in all the policies and the rules that are part of surviving the school. Next, we have, of course, peer groups, your friends. Usually, you, of course, find your friends in your neighborhood or in your school. And a big part of how you behave and the interests that you have is influenced by your peer groups. Next, we have the media. And media is one of the most powerful agents of socialization because basically media through TV, internet, radio, and pop culture, we get to learn about many standards of how it is to become an acceptable member of society in whatever social group we want to belong in. Media has also been responsible in terms of socializing us with globalized and Western values, like for example, liberal thought, liberalism, and liberalizing the body are, some ideas that we have seen as standards based on what we see in international media that we have access to because we have, internet access or television and broadcast media access. There were some agents of socialization that were not mentioned in the video of Nicole, and these are workplace. Basically, in the workplace, you are still taught to behave as a good citizen. And there are still gender norms that are being pushed. Like, for example, those who identify to be female but were born male, they're still forced to act as male or dress up as male. And this is an example of how workplaces still propagate and socialize, traditional gender norms in our society. The way you dress up, the way you bring yourself, and you also are being socialized to be formal in interacting with, customers and clients and colleagues. So this is the way workplace is trying to socialize us and teach us about the norms. Another important agent of socialization, especially in the Philippines, is religion. When we attend masses and other religious activities, we get to learn about how it is to become a good Christian or Catholic Filipino or a good Muslim Filipino if you're from the South or you are a Muslim, no? So religion tells you about the things that are morally correct and morally wrong. Religion tells you that you should be good to your neighbors, diba? You should be generous, you should not be stealing, you should respect your elders. So religion also kind of contributes to your whole socialization process. And then Goffman also tells us that in society there are also called total institutions wherein the socialization is more rigid, more precise, and more personality changing. It changes your personality because, generally the earlier agents of socialization we have discussed here, they change who you are, but it doesn't change the core of your personality. You still get to be you. Despite being influenced by your family, education, peer groups, media, workplace, and religion. But total institutions change your core identity, your core personality, because they want you to be like other people in that specific institution. And examples of total institutions are prisons, convents. This was not given as an example by Nicole Sweeney, but convents and seminaries are also total institutions because they really change a lot of your core identity and core personalities in order to have a similar personality and similar belief system and a similar way of life with other priests and nuns and other tawag dito, mga aspirants in that given religious space. And of course, the military is a total institution because, very rigid ang social system doon, and your previous life as a civilian will be destroyed. Your schedules, your way of life, being a civilian will not hold water while you are in the military. They will completely change that. And there's also a process called resocialization. Like, for example, you've been to prison, you've served your time, and you've been socialized to be in the prison for a long time, and then you'll be integrated back to your community. That's an example of resocialization. To learn again the social norms and the values and the beliefs that you have, you have forgotten maybe while you were in prison for a long period of time. So that's resocialization. Next, we also discussed about social interaction and performance. And of course, social interaction is basically when two people relate to each other, exchange ideas, exchange certain symbols, whatever. And of course, there was also an explanation of how being in a society is a performance. And then we also understand that social structure basically constrains and facilitates our behavior. Remember agency and structure? Diba? Like, for example, if you belong in a low class or a poor class sector in society, some of your behaviors are constrained because you are belonging in that specific social structure. Or for example, your gender is female, then some of your activities may be facilitated and constrained by being a female person. Because social structures like gender, like family, this sets expectations on us. And this expectation basically controls the way we act in a society. So, how do we define the expectations? Our expectations are coming with our status in society. Our status is a position in society. And each person holds many statuses. Like, for example, me, I'm a teacher, I'm a researcher, I'm a male, I'm a middle class individual, I'm a Filipino. So I hold all these statuses, and those statuses, when they come together in me, they're called status set. And every person has their own status sets. Now, a status could be ascribed or achieved. Ascribed could be something that you were born with or something that you were born into. Example of ascribed status is your sex at birth, or your ascribed status is also your ethnicity that you were born in, and your nationality. These are ascribed status, yung nationality at birth. And then we also have achieved status. These are the status that you kind of work for and choose to be. Like, for example, in my case, being a teacher is something that I chose to be and something that I put effort on. So these are achieved status. Or for example, you as students, you chose to be students and you put some effort to becoming college students. These are achieved status. And of course, ascribed status is something that we don't have an option to have. Like, for example, I cannot easily, change my sex to female. I could change my gender, but my anatomical male structure, I cannot change it. And as long as I have it, there are certain expectations because I have this body. Unlike achieved status, wherein you can choose not to be that. And then, of course, in our master status, there's one status that basically defines us at a given time. Like, for example, as you are hearing me, the status that comes through is not probably my being male or not probably my being Filipino, although I still have it. Probably my master status at the moment is being a teacher. And that being a teacher is called the master status. Now, of course, in our lives, you can experience some conflicts in the way we live out our statuses. Like for example, I have a status of being a gay person, for example, like that. But at the same time, I also still hold to the status of being a Catholic. And sometimes there are Catholic dogmas that dislike some beliefs that I have being as an LGBTQIA individual. And that basically is a status inconsistency that I have. I am a Catholic, but at the same time LGBTQIA, and certain beliefs that are kind of not aligned with each other. So that's called a status inconsistency. And each status comes with roles. Basically, these are sets of behaviors and expectations that we perform, and each status that we have has a role set. Now, ibig sabihin, this is the set of the things that you need to do when you are regarded the status of being blank. For example, as a teacher, my role set would be teaching you, setting up an online class, grading your scores, or grading your assignments. So these are my role sets. Now, given all these status sets, some of our roles may conflict with each other. Like for example, a female teacher who is also a mother has to go through this challenge of, should I go to work if my child is sick? So I have two roles there. One, this is a weekday and I have a class. So my role as a teacher is to go to school. However, I am also a mother, and my role is to take care of my sick child. So this challenge, or this intersecting and this differentiating roles that is being experienced by the mother at the moment, who was also a teacher, is called a role conflict. And then we also have what we call role strains, which are basically the physical and mental imbalance in this equilibrium we feel because we are juggling so many roles. Now, for example, some of you may be juggling the role of being a son or being a daughter in a family where you need to help your parents at the house, but at the same time you're also doing online classes and you're doing your role as student, and probably you could also have signed up yourself as a volunteer for a feeding program during this pandemic, and you have so many assignments, you have so many things to do at the house, and then you have so many volunteer work, and it's suddenly it suddenly become overbearing for you, and that's called a role strain. Next, we also have what we call a role exit. Role exit means that this is you relinquishing a certain role in your life because, you may have had some sort of role strain, or it must have been decided upon you. So, for example, a voluntary role exit would be, you're super overburdened about being a house person, doing online classes as a student, and a volunteer work, and because of that, you had to exit your role as a volunteer for feeding programs in your community because you can't do it anymore. So that's a voluntary role exit. An induced role exit or an involuntary role exit would be, for example, you didn't get a good grade for you to be able to get into a course, so you have to let go of being, for example, an accountant or being a lawyer because you couldn't get in there, and go to some other course. So exiting your role as a student in a given course is something that's involuntary. It's not something. And of course, between a voluntary and an involuntary role exit, mas mahirap, it's more difficult for a person to cope with an involuntary role exit compared to a voluntary one. And of course, one of the greatest arguments in sociology that basically influences our statuses and roles in society is the social construction of reality, which basically argues that the reality that we are experiencing has been socially constructed. The roles of being a teacher has been decided by many social interactions before us. The role of being a student has been predefined by all of these norms that we have agreed upon that this should be what a student is. This is what should a female should be. So there is no tangible thing that is called a student. These are all things that aren't essential. These are socially constructed. And as we move along a socially constructed reality, Irving Goffman says that all that we do in society is just like playing out a role in a theater, and this is what he called dramaturgical analysis. And one of the tenets of dramaturgical analysis is that when we try to interact with people and we try to act and behave in a certain society, we act in such a way that we are trying to, show a certain impression or set a certain impression of us by the people who we interact with. And the people who we interact with are our audiences. And that process of trying to set an image of ourselves through the acts that we do as we interact with other people, which are audiences, is called our impression management. So, being a teacher is a show. Being a student is a role in a show. Being a mother is a role in a show. A show that we have imagined for so many years. And we agree that this is an important part of what society should be. And we create impressions every day that we are good or bad in the roles that we are making. And when we do our impression management, we use props and nonverbal cues. Like for example, as a teacher, we're supposed to wear decent clothes, semi-formal clothes, business attire, because business attire was a symbol that we are corporate, we are formal, we are someone who has, who should be regarded with respect because of their intellectualism, etc., etc. And of course, non-verbal cues, like for example, imagine if I am speaking expletives right now, I don't think that that's a very nice impression that you will have of me as a teacher, because again, the expectation that you have of me as a teacher is to be able to speak eloquently, although I'm not sure if I'm speaking like perfectly eloquently, but definitely outside my expectation is for me to speak like a palengkero, or for me to speak like, a rapper, a very explicit rapper. So I wouldn't do that, because your expectation of me is I should be speaking with a demonstration of my intellect. Ayun. And all of the gestures, all of the props we use hold so many meanings, and all of these are called sign vehicles. For example, this act of me encircling these words with red ink is a sign vehicle that this is what I am talking about. And this is a sign vehicle. And in our lives, in our social lives, we have what we call a front stage and a backstage. And a front stage is where we are holding our certain statuses and performing all the roles that are expected of us. And that's front stage, and where everybody can see you and they expect you to do something, and of course you behave as you are expected. But in our lives, we also have a backstage, and usually a backstage is what we do in our private spaces, where we can already drop our statuses behind and take on a status that is not anymore so tasking. For example, in my case, in a normal day, in a non-online class setting, of course, when I am in campus, that's my front stage as a teacher, so I have to act like a teacher, right? But after class, upon going home, already dropped that act. I will no longer, the roommates that I have, I will not be teaching them. I will not be wearing what I am wearing as a teacher to my bed, right? Probably I'd be doing things that are not expected of a teacher. You like laugh really loud, or something, or probably not wear my hair good, because this is already my backstage. It's my private space, and I could already drop that act of being a teacher. And in society, when we perform, we also perform with others. And when we perform with others in order to satisfy a given expectation, we perform as what we call a team. Like for example, when you ride a jeepney, right? And you say, bayad po, and you reach out your hand with your money. you no longer have to say, pwede po pakiabot. Usually, you don't say that anymore. If they've seen you like handing out your money, they already know that they have to take your money, and then pass it to the driver if you're not near the driver. And then the driver, gives you the change, pass it to someone near him, and then gives it to you. That's an example of a team, a collective performance. It's something that is not something that's written. It's not a formal rule, but we do it anyway because based on our many takings of that role, of that situation, we already know that that is what should be the case to be done. And of course, you could also be taking the role of the one passing the money from a person to the driver. So this is an example of a team, a collective performance. The third lesson that was given for that module are the social groups. And of course, in the beginning, we have defined and differentiated groups from aggregates and categories. So basically, groups are, people who interact with each other and identify that they are part of the group. Like for example, your family, your friends, your coworkers are examples of groups because you interact with them at a regular basis and you identify that I belong to this group, right? And that is differentiated with aggregates wherein, for example, you are in the LRT, you're waiting for the next train, and then there's a mass of people waiting with you. That's called an aggregate. You're together, but you're not interacting, and definitely you don't have a feeling of belongingness with these people. And then we also have categories. Categories naman are people that you don't interact with, but you identify with them. Like for example, in my case, my category, social category that I belong to probably would be LGBTQIA. I don't interact with all LGBTQIA people, but I identify with them. So that's an example of a social category. Now, there are times where in aggregates could become groups. Like for example, there's a set of, let's say, stranded pedestrians because nagkaroon ng na-stuck sila because there had been typhoon, tapos binaha sila. And then they started helping each other out and they started interacting because of that. They started helping each other out, carrying each other from one place to another so that they don't get wet. So that's an example of how an aggregate can eventually turn into an interacting group. An example of a category turning into groups, for example, let's say LGBTQIA people, they come together and protest about their rights during Pride. So that's an example of a category turning into a group. But basically, groups should be regularly interacting with each other, and then they also identify that they belong to that group. And then throughout our lives, we will be members of primary groups, which are basically strong groups. Ibig sabihin, this will last longer and are usually small in terms of number. And they provide us with expressive, needs. Like for example, emotional well-being, feeling of connectedness, pagdadamayan sa mga personal na problema. These are primary group benefits. Example of primary groups that we have would be your small intimate number of friends, your family members. And then of course we also have what we call secondary groups, and these groups are basically large groups. Like for example, your student organizations that you are part in. And then these groups are basically impersonal. You didn't come there for emotional well-being. You came there because you wanted to achieve a certain goal, you wanted to achieve certain credence, but it's not really to have personal, probably to gain more friends, which eventually become a primary group to you. But generally, being a part of that organization is your secondary group. They give you what we call instrumental benefits, which is basically goal setting instead of emotional well-being. And then there are groups that we call voluntary groups. An example of voluntary groups are friends because we choose them, organizations that we go to, the companies that we apply in, the schools that we go to. So these are voluntary groups. Involuntary groups are groups that we are forced to be a part of like your mental institutions and the jail, no, the prisons. Now, there are many factors that influence how certain groups become to be, how they are sustained, how they relate to each other, members relate to each other. And one of the factors that influence group dynamics is leadership. Now, there are two types of leadership. We have instrumental leadership. This is the type of leadership whose goal is to provide goal-oriented objectives, no? So this leadership basically, we have to do this, we have to finish this. And usually examples of instrumental leadership, instrumental leaders in a group is, for example, kung sino yung leader sa group ninyo to be able for you to finish your thesis or whatever. Expressive leadership is really more about emotional and social well-being. They're they care about the personal needs and the emotional needs of the group and the belongingness needs of the groups. So for example, the mother in the family is usually the expressive leader of the family. And then, of course, we have many leadership styles, actually, but the basic three are authoritarian leadership. It is where the leadership tells everyone what they need to do without asking for the opinions of the other group members. So usually, authoritarian leaderships are bad in relation to decisions that are casual. Like, for example, no, I want us to go to this is where we want to go for vacation. No ifs, no buts. But authoritarian leaderships are good in relation to crisis situations. Like for example, if I am the only nurse in the group and then somebody experiences like some sort of choking emergency, I can get to, to be the authority in terms of, okay, this is what we do to take care of him. No more asking questions. Because this is an emergency situation. I will not anymore elicit your opinions. We have to act fast. And as the person who holds the competence to be able to address this emergency, I will be the authoritarian leader of the group. Next, we have democratic leadership, and this is usually the most light leadership. The democratic leadership is when the leader also shares some of his authority to the group, by asking them about their opinions. Okay, guys, so where do you want to go for the summer vacation? So the leader is basically just the one facilitating in terms of getting suggestions and helping the group to be able to come up with a decision. That's democratic leadership. We also have laissez-faire leadership, which is basically the leader who's just called the leader but he doesn't do anything and lets the group decide for everything. There are ways wherein the laissez-faire leadership is okay, especially for example, the leader has done too many For example, you have a really explicitly planned trip, vacation, and of course there's a leader who kind of plans the itinerary and everything, and there are certain decisions that he had already 100% delegated to some of his friends or some of the people who are part of the tour. For example, where should we eat? It's up to you. I will no longer ask for opinions, or I will no longer direct you to make your opinions. But for the things that you have to eat, it's up to you. So sometimes laissez-faire is good, especially when there are too many decisions that are already facilitated by the leader. And then we also have what we call group conformity. Group conformity is the extent to which, members of the group will abide by the rules and the norms that are pressured into by the groups. And again, of course, remember the Stanley Milgram experiment, the one wherein the person is electrocuted, etc., etc. And of course, we learned that in order to make people conform, you appeal to values rather than give direct orders. And if you see, how our politicians are creating their image during election time, most of the messages are really, appeal to values. Like for example, tapang at malasakit. So this is an example of, a narrative that appeals to values. Or for example, para sa laylayan ng lipunan. So these are, messages that obviously wants us to conform with their group ideals by appealing to our values. There's also what we call groupthink. Groupthink is basically, when our decision making is overpowered by, the group. Right? For example, if you remember in your classes, when you say, okay, so who says it's letter A? And then, even if you're sure it's letter C, but you see that everyone is raising their hand at letter A, you already get to be kind of pressured to also answer letter A, because your thoughts, you feel like, oh my gosh, nobody else is thinking about my thoughts, so probably my thoughts is wrong. So it's always like we decide with the collective. So that's an example of groupthink. Next, group size also influences group dynamics. Like we said, no, smaller groups, they tend to last longer than larger groups, you know. And then we have types of groups in terms of small groups. We have dyads. Examples of dyads: married couples, right? Or siblings, kuya, ate, or wife and husband. And we also have triads. No, examples of triads could be, let's say, mother, father, child, or mother, parent, teacher, student. So these are example of triads, and each triad or each dyad has specific social interactions that different from another dyad with different statuses. And then, of course, we also have social diversity as an influencer of group dynamics. Of course, if the group is more homogeneous, then the group would be more tight-knit. The group would be sustained better compared to a heterogeneous group. And then throughout our lives, we will be influenced by two groups, no? In groups and out groups. In groups are the groups that we feel that we belong in, and out groups are the groups that we feel that we don't belong in. And usually, sometimes, out groups are sources of animosity and opposition against the in groups. An example of an in group, out group that's very obvious is, for example, DDS versus Dilawans. Yeah, it's an example of an in group, out group. Like, for example, if you are not for the president, you're immediately a Dilawan. Or for example, if you agree with the specific na sinabi ng presidente, you're already a DDS. So this is an example of of course, that's an example of, a dual thinking, which is also emphasized or facilitated by having in groups and out groups. And also across our lives, we will be also influenced by reference groups. Reference groups are groups that we may be a part of or we may not be a part of, who we feel are as like normal groups. Like, for example, for LGBTQIA people, especially when they aren't that empowered yet, they would feel that the reference group, which is the heterosexual family, for instance, is the normal way that a family should be done. And for them, because they do not fit in the narrative or the characteristics of a heterosexual family, the same-sex family would feel less, because they're not the reference. Because the reference has always been a heterosexual family. So when they don't see same-sex families being represented in the media, then same-sex families won't be seen as a reference group, and they will be seen as less valued in society. So, reference groups. And then also, the strength of the relationships between social groups are also influenced by social networks. Social networks is basically, how many people are tied to us, no? And usually social networks is very much related to social networking, social media, right? Wherein there are nodes and ties that basically attach us together. Like, for example, I may not know you, but for example, we both follow a certain artist, for example, a K-pop artist, then we are tied to that node. And probably then we belong to a social network. And sometimes when you belong to a large social network, when there's an activity wherein all of that social network is involved because of that specific node that we are all tied to, like that K-pop person, then there's a chance that we can also access whatever social resources that other people tied to that node have. And finally, the last lesson that was discussed is the formal organization. Again, formal organization is an example of a group, no? So unlike other social groups, a formal organization is one that's goal-oriented. It could be a company, it could be a school, it could be a workplace, no, it could be a church, no. So formal organization basically is a group that was designed to have a certain goal in society. And so, of course, there are three types of organizations, and the first one is utilitarian. Utilitarian is we voluntarily become a part of this organization because we will give something to the organization and the organization will give something back to us. We have a goal that we can achieve through that organization, and the organization can achieve its goal through us. So an example of utilitarian organization is the companies we get employed in. I provide you my services, you provide me with money and benefits. So that's an example of a utilitarian organization. Or for example, students, I contribute by doing my learning, and then you give me my diploma at the end of my 4-year or 3-year stay. Next, we have normative organizations. The normative organizations are organizations that we voluntarily become a part of, but we do not really want like some sort of tangible goal from it. Usually, we join that organization voluntarily to provide services, but we don't really ask for something in return. Like for example, church. No, we join church. It gives us expressive to be able to worship and to be able to serve, but it doesn't really give us like money or anything in return, except probably spirituality. But it's not like utilitarian organizations that really give you something tangible and economic, no? Or for example, joining Red Cross, no? Offering your services for Red Cross. And why do you do that? Probably because you want self-fulfillment, you want to be able to have a feeling of being able to volunteer. And then we also have what we call coercive organizations, and these organizations are organizations that we get into involuntarily, no? Hopefully you don't get here, because coercive organization examples dyan ay prison and psychiatric facilities. And then of course, we also discussed that one of the main characteristics of formal organizations is bureaucracy. And then of course, Nicole goes on to describe the 6 characteristics of bureaucracy. Just like for example, not all, no, some examples would be impersonal relationships, goal-oriented, having written details about procedures and processes. No? So, and most of formal organizations that we have today in the modern society are bureaucratic. But of course, Max Weber also described that bureaucracy can also become like an iron cage that we feel that we are locked into, and we have lost our identities because of bureaucracy. And so sometimes people could experience what we call bureaucratic ritualism, or in the reason why a formal organization is still existing and is being participated by its members. It's because we are no longer specifically working towards the cultural goal or the vision, but is already working just because we want to fulfill the processes that we have set for that institution. And I've been to some organization which feels like that, na parang sa sobrang dami ng mga procedures, sa sobrang dami ng mga rules at saka policies because of quality assurance, etc., nawala na yung spirit ng mismong organization. So, kayo, for future, organization developers, business owners, you really have to rethink like all of the policies and procedures that you are putting into your institution, and making sure that, in following all these quality assurance policies, you don't miss the very idea of what it means to be in that organization, the ultimate goal. And nga, related to bureaucratic ritualism is bureaucratic inertia, wherein major part of the goals that certain formal organization aspires is not just anymore the main goal of the society, or a main goal of that organization, but basically to make the process flawless. And this is a critique against, for example, school accreditations. No, sometimes schools get so caught up with accreditations that they clean up their procedures, they complete the paperworks, and then because of year after year of applying for accreditation, their work becomes, their goals, their strategic objectives become very centered to accreditation and not anymore, what are we as a school, and I think that's the same also not only in educational institutions but other institutions who are very much obsessed with structures, procedures, organizational efficiency, that they forget what the organization is really for in the beginning. Next, we have oligarchy, which is also a problem of bureaucracy wherein, especially when you have a really, really big formal organization, example, the government, we have only a few people, governing a lot of people. And of course, oligarchy is supposed to be, democracy is supposed to be a good thing, but because there are only few people who are given seats, they could, have what we call an iron law of oligarchy, an unintended or / intended authoritarian leadership, because of oligarchy. So some people may be left behind because it is only the will of a few that is being followed in a given formal organization. And therefore, some people who are in a formal organization with such bureaucratic ritualism and inertia would feel alienated from the formal organization itself. Probably the teachers would feel like they're just cogs to a machine towards accreditation, and they no longer feel like they're giving their best to the teachers because they're doing a lot in accreditation. I'm not speaking for DLSU because I've been in DLSU for just two terms at the moment, so I can't really say. But for the previous schools that I've been in, they had a tendency to be like that, to be more focused. So it kind of alienates you to your actual status in that formal organization is, because of you have been impended and pressured upon all this extra procedural stuff in the formal organization. And Frederick Taylor is a scientist who introduced what we call scientific management. It means that the way we manage people and resources could be done scientifically. And according to Frederick Taylor, there are 5 basic steps of scientific management. We have planning, wherein we set our vision, mission, goals for the formal organization. We have organizing, wherein we try to look into what are the offices and what should be the organizational structure. And then we staff. We fill in the organizational structure with people, with good people. And then we direct, we tell them what they need to do. And then we control, we evaluate their performance. So these are like the basic functions of management. Of course, now we have more intricate and advanced iterations of the scientific management. But the original work of Frederick Taylor was this 5. And then, of course, the performance of a formal organization is also influenced by the organizational environment, the social, political, and the cultural context where the organization is found. Siyempre, in certain organizations, like for example in the Philippines, wherein hindi pa tayo masyadong tech-savvy and the culture is still very traditional, and of course we are in a very volatile state politically. So, the organizational environment influences formal organizations to be a little bit more uptight compared to, of course, more liberal and developed countries. And it has always also been argued that flat organizations, meaning, organizations na konti lang yung managers, For example, manager, assistant manager, people, yun lang, is much more stronger and more closer compared to those with tall organization. Like for example, sa LaSalle, we have the chancellor, vice chancellor, dean, vice dean, chair, vice chair, faculty. So that's an example of a tall organization. But of course, tall organizations is a response to a very complex organization. Siyempre, you cannot expect a flat organization. You cannot expect chancellor and then faculty. Mahirap yun, Kasi there's so many people that he has to organize. That's why we had to have a tall organization so that mas ma-oversee ang mas maraming tao at mas maraming procedures. And then Ritzer, this is one of the more famous sociologists, argues that our society now has been influenced by the style of McDonald's. And this is what he calls McDonaldization of society. He argues that just like McDonald's, some of the processes and expectations in formal organizations act like a McDonald's fast food. Like for example, precision, diba? For example, when you get a French fries from McDonald's, when you get a French fries today na regular, you'd expect the same size and the same taste that you get tomorrow or 5 months from now. And that's the same with other organizations. Like for example, iPhone, right? The iPhone 11 that you buy now, if you buy the same model 5 years after, it's like totally the same thing, right? Or for example, you can tell a Lasallian graduate from another type of graduate. There's like a common thing about Lasallian graduates. So the precision of how products are created, whether these products are services or these products are actual tangible products, it's an example of it's an example of McDonaldization of society. Calculability is also something that's seen in McDonald's. Now, for example, the ability for us to say that you will get your food in 1 minute, diba? Ganun na rin in most societies. Okay, so you expect your COVID-19 rapid test to come in 3 to 5 days. And if it's beyond 5 days, then that organization is said to be inefficient. Or for example, you will get your document from LaSalle in 3 days. If you get it in more than 3 days, your organization is called efficient. So there is a number that we put on services and products to say that they are efficient. Calculability. And this is something that has also been seen in McDonald's in the 1950s. So yun yung sinasabi ni Ritzer, McDonaldization of society. Most organizations and most processes in society seems like the process of McDonald's, the fast food. And these are all products of rationality. Calculability, reflexivity, precision, right? Having the same expectations every time you go to the same organization. These are good products of rationality. But again, the human touch of how it is to be in a group has sometimes left the interactions that we have when we go around and interact within and with formal organizations. And because of that, it goes above our heads, right? All these processes, it goes above our heads. We no longer think of them. We no longer criticize them, right? But sometimes they overpower us, right? And this is what Ritzer calls as the irrationality of rationality. That probably we have to look into the ways we are doing things. Probably it takes the humanity out of the interactions because it's so impersonal, it's so formal, so goal-oriented that we forget that human beings are the ones that are being involved in the society. So in this video, we were able to talk about the following. So we were able to talk about socialization, social interaction and performance, social groups, and formal organizations. Next week, we'll talk about deviance and crime.